Salam all, it's your friendly neighborhood physicist, and today we are going to talk about epitaxial growth techniques. So let's roll.
Abang jago, sorry bang jago, ampun bang jago.
So before we get into the techniques, what is epitaxial growth? Epitaxial refers to the method of depositing or growing a crystalline film on a crystalline substrate. Note that there are three important methods of crystal growth, which are solid growth, liquid growth, and vapor growth. In this video, we will go through 6 different techniques of epitaxial growth in details. So the first technique that we'll be observing is called as the bridgment technique, which is a melt form of crystal growth. This is because in bridgment, the material is melted in a vertical cylindrical container surrounded by 2 furnaces, a hot furnace on top of the cold furnace. Then the cylinder is tapered conically with a bottom point. The container is then moved slowly from the hot zone into the cold zone, very slow, about 1 to 30 mm per hour. This action causes crystallization to occur at the tip and continuously until nucleus is formed. The bridgment crystal growth is perhaps the simplest melt technique, and it has been used extensively for the growth of lead iodide crystals for detector applications. The primary advantage of bridgment technique is because of the ease implementation and the fact that the material with low melting point is very suitable for this technique. The primary disadvantage of bridgment method is perhaps because of the growing crystal remains in contact with the growth ampoule. A contact with the quartz crucible can lead to the form of impurities, and if the growing crystal sticks to the surface of the crucible, large thermal strains may be introduced in the crystal as it cools. So the next technique is created by a guy named Zoralski. So let's just call it SIZ. Same as bridgment, in SIZ technique, the material to be grown is also melted by induction or resistant heating under a controlled atmosphere in a suitable non-reacting container. This is required to prepare a high purity of molten, usually silicon, which will be the source of silicon wafer. A seed crystal is lowered to touch the molten charge and act as the base of the crystal growth. When the temperature of the seed is maintained very low compared to the temperature of the melt by suitable water cooling arrangement, the molten charge in contact with the seed will solidify on the seed. Then the seed is pulled with simultaneous rotation of the seed rod and the crucible in order to grow perfect single crystal. The SIZ method is the most important method in the production of ingot or bulk single crystals of a wide range of electronic and optical materials such as silicon wafer. The advantage of this method is cost saving by multiple using of the crucible and saving the time period for cooling down and heating up periods. However, the low thermal conductivity of the liquid encapsulant causes large temperature gradients and large temperature non-linearities in the growing crystal. This is unfavorable with respect to the crystal quality, as a relatively large number of structural defects are generated in the crystal. On to the next one is molecular beam epitaxy. In this method, the material to be deposited is heated in a diffusion evaporator cell. It then diffuses or effuses out of the cell, then heats toward the target surface substrate like a beam. Once the molecule atom hits the surface, it will either stick to the surface or bounce a little bit before reacting to stick on the surface. Using this method, a really thin film can be achieved because the molecules come out of the evaporator in a beam, and the rate at which the molecules are emitted from the cell can be controlled precisely by controlling its temperature. The most important thing of this technique is the setup, which must be in ultra-high vacuum environment. This is to minimize impurities and also minimize the collision between molecules along the way to reach the substrate surface. As you have heard to all this way, we can see that MBE is used for thin film deposition of single crystals, which also one of the tools to develop nanotechnologies. The good thing about this method are it is clean and free of oxide layer and controllable since it has a very low growth rate. The bad side of this, well, it comes with price. LPE or liquid phase epitaxy is growing epitaxial layers on substrate by direct precipitation from liquid phase. It consists of three manifestations of the LPE technique, which are realized in the form of tipping, dipping, and sliding boat. We will focus on the most famous one, which is the sliding boat. Here, the bottom part of the boat is fixed inside the quartz furnace and a thermocouple is attached to measure its temperature. It also contains one or more grooves to hold the substrate wafer. The top part is called a slider and can be moved back and forth. It also contains one or more wells to contain the growth melt. During the process, gallium arsenide substrate is loaded into the boat and the slider well is filled with polycrystalline gallium arsenide melt. Then the slider temperature is lowered at constant rate, and as the growth temperature is reached, the slider is pushed to bring the melt zone above the substrate. LPE materials has excellent optical properties, which is in the application of optical devices such as lasers, light-emitting diodes, infrared detectors, and solar cells, despite of as an inexpensive technique with large deposition rates of high purity layers. LPE is highly favorable for the growth of thick layers of semiconductors owing to their very high growth rate. LPE is 10 to 100 times faster than other VPE methods, plus with low cost of this method takes. However, the method lacks in controlling the doping concentration, thickness of layers, and the smoothness between the interfaces. Next, one of the most famous techniques of growing materials via vapor is CVD or chemical vapor deposition. It is performed in a reactor consisting of a quartz reaction chamber into which a susceptor is placed. The susceptor provides support for wafers and uniform thermal environment. There are three basic types of reactor, which are horizontal, vertical, and cylindrical reactor. The process starts with the usage of hydrogen gas to remove air from vacuum in the reactor. The reactor is then heated until the thermal equilibrium is established. A chemical reaction occurs when inserting acid hydrochloric gas and silicon at the surface of wafer producing silicon chloride gas, which then reacts chemically with hydrogen gas producing silicon or epitaxial layer. The process is often used in the semiconductor industry to produce thin films, including the growth of the thinnest material in the world, graphene. From this fact, we know that the process is flexible for designing and new technology can be developed on the base of the existing producing unit. But it needs high temperature supply around 600 degrees, at which the substrate is unstable and will ruin the product. Last but not least, let's go through the final technique, which is metal organic chemical vapor deposition, or MOCVD or MOVPE. MOCVD is an enhanced version of CVD, which is used to create a high purity of crystalline semiconducting thin film and micro or nano structures. Instead of the name, the difference of MOCVD and CVD is that it requires relatively low temperature for growing metal on semiconductor substrate. Also, the metal organics are compounds where each atom element is bound to one or more carbon atoms. MOCVD use surface chemical reaction, which is the transport of precursor molecules by a carrier gas of hydrogen or nitrogen onto the heated substrate. The process started with injection of reagents into the reactor chamber through separated orifices in a water cooled shower head injecting molecule. A homogeneous gas phase is achieved at 5 mm below the shower head. The substrate is placed on a rotating susceptor which heat the substrate from below to allow the formation of thin film. A very fine mesh of injection tubes can ensure ideal growth condition and thickness uniformity. MOCVD is used for building compound semiconductor devices, optoelectronic devices, LEDs, and many more. From MOCVD, we can design for improved precursors and prepare complex ferroelectric oxides. Although the precursors are very hazardous, it is because they are formed of high toxic gases due to formation of phosphine. Well, that's it guys. That is the 6 techniques of epitaxial growth from, I don't know, many. We can see that different techniques have their own pros and cons depending on the type of product and the material to be grown. That's a lot of minutes, so see you next time.